To the January 11th, 2021 COVID-19 clinical care rounds focused on EMS patient care and operations. I'm John Kramer. I'm an emergency physician and EMS physician and the director of the National Office of EMS at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. I'm also the team lead for the HHS Healthcare Resiliency Working Group EMS pre-hospital team. I'm also the EMS medical director for the Caroline County, Maryland Department of Emergency Services. The purpose of these sessions is peer-to-peer real-time sharing of COVID-19 EMS challenges and successes. In developing these sessions, our guiding principle is if I'm preparing my EMS system for COVID-19 patients, the clinicians I want to learn from are those who have the most experience. This is a voluntary, public-private collaboration. Thanks to the multiple professional organizations who have collaborated in this series. It is not intended to be redundant or replace any organization's initiatives. It is intended to be sharing of clinical experience, not recommendations or guidance. These ECHO clinical rounds you're not participating in are focused on healthcare providers sharing their successes and challenges with other healthcare providers. Thanks to Project ECHO, Dr. Bruce Struminger, Amanda, Amy, Celine, Max, and Lauren, and the rest of their team for the peer-to-peer learning platform we're using for these rounds. Upcoming ECHO sessions currently are scheduled for all US noon Eastern time. Tuesdays rounds are in critical care, Thursdays on emergency department, and we still have a special series on outpatient therapeutic modalities on Wednesdays. It's self-evident that our nation's medical response challenges are changing every day. We continue to work to identify topics for these peer-to-peer learning rounds that are most timely and helpful to clinicians. For the ECHO clinical rounds, we continue to have participants from many states and multiple countries, predominantly physicians, nurses, and EMS clinicians. Appreciation to NETEC, the National Emerging Special Pathogen Training and Education Center, for their support with these rounds. These ECHO clinical rounds and NETEC's webinars are complementary to each other. We continue to receive many questions for each of these rounds and apologize in advance that we're not able to answer all of them. We do select major themes from the questions we've received and hope to cover them today and on subsequent sessions. We'll also be doing crowdsourcing and polling questions with results shown in real time so that we have the opportunity to learn together. I'd now like to turn it over to Dr. Struminger for some logistics and other information. Bruce?
Thank you, John, and welcome everyone. Again, Happy New Year, and special welcome to Jeff Jarvis for joining us today to share his experience. Really looking forward to his talk. So just going to review a few logistic issues. We really appreciate your questions and comments, so please keep them coming and put them in the Q&A function along the bottom of the Zoom toolbar, and we'll try to do our best to answer as many of them as we can. If you have any technical or logistic issues, please put those in the chat. We'll be monitoring that and try to help you if we can. We are recording today's session, as we always do, and your attendance is consent to be recorded. Thank you for that. Today's presentation by Jeff, we will be making that available on our website. I think it's available, or he may have made a few last-minute adjustments. So anyway, there may be a version available in the announcement that went out this morning, but if not, we'll be sharing it on our website, and we'll share that link in the chat along with the recording of today's session. We hope anyone that would like to get CME and continuing professional development credit will take advantage of that opportunity. They're offered through the University of New Mexico, where Project ECHO is based. We'll put a link in the chat 15 minutes before the end of the session. You'll have 48 hours to complete the brief survey. It takes 2 to 3 minutes. We really appreciate your feedback. It's how we continue to improve these sessions, and it helps us know what topics you want to be learning about in the short run and medium term. So we'll also share that in the chat. These learning sessions are focused on improving patient care and health systems and supporting clinicians. Just a reminder to keep them apolitical and non-commercial. Thank you for that. And a quick note about data use. You share data with us when you register, when you complete the polls, when you put things in the Q&A. We just want to remind everyone we take data stewardship very seriously, and the data is well safeguarded. What we do share with John and Rick and Asper is all de-identified. Just a reminder about the NETech webinar series. As John mentioned, NETech is a partner in this COVID-19 clinical round series. They have a webinar coming up this Wednesday on lessons learned in navigating simultaneous disaster response scenarios. So I think that will be of interest to many here, and we recommend you sign up for that if you can. If you can't make it live, they record all the sessions and they're available on their website. John also mentioned this HHS Asper COVID-19 Outpatient Therapeutics mini-series. It's been running since December and will run at least through the end of this month. The next session is Wednesday. They're every Wednesday. The date on this slide is December 16, but this Wednesday we'll have colleagues from Mass General Hospital talking about the experience in Boston of implementing delivery of monoclonal antibodies. So please join us for that. We'll share a link to the registration in the chat. Also, the AAMC, the Association of American Medical Colleges, is a partner in these rounds. They have a great clinical guidance repository that they keep updated on a weekly basis. We'll share a link to that site. It's got a wealth of great information. And now, John, back to you for the crowdsourcing question.
Thank you, Bruce. As folks are aware, if they have participated in previous sessions, we've talked on sessions in the past about vaccine issues and the hesitancy on the part of healthcare providers and EMS clinicians about getting the vaccine. Candidly, that's one of the reasons that we have asked Jeff to join us today. He's done a lot of work in researching the issues associated with the vaccines, their development, their use, their safety profile, and things like that. So given that we have talked about this, and there still is some ongoing hesitancy on the part of healthcare providers, what can we as a community do to address those concerns? So please, throughout the course of the discussion today, chime in on what we can do to address these concerns and hopefully better inform the community. When you respond, please indicate where you're responding from in terms of if you're outside the United States, where in the world, and if you're in the United States, what state or area you're responding from. Thank you. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Jeff Jarvis. Jeff is the medical director for Williamson County EMS and Marble Falls area EMS in Central Texas, as well as the chief medical officer for Flight Bridge ED. He's board certified in both emergency medicine and emergency medical services and maintains a clinical practice at the Baylor Scott and White Hospital in Round Rock, Texas. As some of us, Jeff began his career as an EMS clinician over 30 years ago and continues to retain his active paramedic license today. He attended college at Texas A&M, something important about that school, got a master's in EMS from New York Medical College, did his medical school at the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston, and emergency medicine training at Scott and White, Texas A&M in Temple, Texas. Jeff, thank you so much for joining us today, sharing your perspective and pearls about EMS vaccines, and helping us to address some of the questions and concerns that still exist. Please bring your slides up, and the floor is yours.
Well, John, thank you very much. And thank you everybody for having me here. So John asked me to talk a little bit about vaccines, and you know, I'm an ER doc, I'm a paramedic, I'm an EMS doc. Vaccines aren't really what I think about on a day-to-day basis. I got sort of forced into thinking about this for the same reason everybody else did. It turns out we're in a pandemic, and 2020 was shot. It looks like maybe a good part of 2021 is going to be shot, turning us all into sort of infectious disease wannabes. And this was something I was dragged kicking and screaming into, because I was really much more interested in focusing on improving airway management. But we have to make sure that we can take care of ourselves and our staff before we can get to the fun stuff of managing airways. So I really started looking at these vaccines when they became available. And the more and more I looked into them, the more and more excited I got, both for the potential to get us back to normal, get me back to managing my normal run-of-the-mill airways, and get us away from having to wear masks all the time. And most importantly, getting us back to bars where we can see each other at conferences. And I know that's really one of my guiding principles. So I'm looking forward to sharing some of what I found about these new vaccines. So why don't we go over real quick just what the evidence for the vaccines are, talk about the side effects, because I understand there is this hesitancy out there, and a lot of the hesitancy has to do with what the side effects are, both the things that we know about and the things we don't know about. And then I want to talk a little bit about hesitancy itself, what the literature says about it, and then what we can do about it. So with that in mind, let's talk about whether these things work or not. So I'm a huge fan of XKCD. He's a guy who does comics, and he does nerd-based comics. And being a nerd, I love these sorts of things. This was his description of what a good, clear result should be. Your results should be so clear that you can demonstrate it with one graph and not need to use complex statistics and regression models. So this is clearly a joke. I mean, we would never see a graph that looks like this. This is clearly something that is just, he's a comic, right? So he's got to exaggerate things. But if we were to see really clear evidence of a vaccine that works, it would look something like this. So up on the y-axis, you have the proportion of patients who got COVID. And then down on the bottom, you would have the x-axis, you would have the time since the vaccination. And what you would like to see is those patients who got the vaccine just having no more COVID, and the group that didn't get it just go straight up. So that's a really clear difference. But obviously, this is just a cartoon. We would never see this in reality. So with this in mind, let's take a look at the actual data, and we can see that we are going to need some pretty complex statistics to show the diff. Oh, no, actually, it turns out we pretty much see a really, really clear difference. This is from the Pfizer study. And we'll look at the one from Moderna. I actually like the plot on the Moderna, but it's because I'm a plotting nerd. The data is exactly the same. And what we see here is there is a very clear breakpoint at around day 10 to 14 after the first shot. And what we see is this blue line, the one going straight up in a linear fashion. That is the proportion of patients who are getting COVID, not testing positive for COVID. And this is an important thing, but testing positive for COVID and being sick. So we're looking for the disease, not a test result. And what you see is a very straight linear line. That red line down on the bottom, those are the people who got the actual vaccine. And you can see after about day 10, they had pretty decent immunity. A few more cases going up, but really not many. So just like XKCD said in the comic, this is the type of result that you really want to see. Very impressive stuff here. Okay, well, I'll get you. Maybe it works. Let's take a look at what the actual numbers are, just for good measure. In case you're wondering, when we talk about 95% efficacious, what does that mean? Well, the outcome that this trial looked at, as well as the trial, the Moderna trial, and these two trials are very identical, but very similar, because that's what the FDA wanted for an EUA. And therefore, these companies, that's the way they structured their trials. So vaccine efficacy is just 1 minus the hazard ratio, and that's essentially the incidence of the disease when given the vaccine divided by the incidence when given placebo, and then turn that into a percentage. So what we see is that in both arms of the trial, we had around 20,000 people. They're actually reporting these things in two ways. The top line is of patients that had not had prior evidence of COVID before they entered into the study. And that was the majority. That second row there shows the people who had evidence of COVID before entering into the trial, plus the ones who didn't. So there's some question about, well, what happens if you had COVID before you got the vaccine? And that's what that last row is designed to answer. So if you look at it, we had 18,000 patients with no prior exposure. 8 of them got COVID. Another 18,000 got the placebo, and 162 of them got it. The vaccine efficacy there is 95%. And you can see that it really doesn't change much whether you had COVID before you got the vaccine or not. Still a really high degree of vaccine efficaciousness. Now, one of the things that the FDA said, and this is, I think this is useful to give us an idea of how well these things are performing. They said, well, really what we're going for is 50% efficacy, and we will approve a vaccine if it has 50% efficacy with the lower limit of a 95% confidence interval, no less than 30. So basically the threshold they had to get over was 30% efficacy. And so they asked for this Bayesian probability, nerd talk. It's really cool stats, but they said, what is the likelihood that we will get at least 30% efficacy? And it is essentially 100%. So they clearly met the threshold for efficacy. All right. Well, what are the side effects? That's really what we want to know. So when they resulted these side effects, they did them in two groups: the local reactions and the systemic reactions. And what you can see, and they broke them down by, they stratified it by age, and then the first dose versus the second dose. In terms of local reaction, the majority of people had some pain at the injection site. I'm about 4 or 5 days now out from my second Pfizer vaccine, and I can tell you I had a little bit of soreness around the injection site. About a day and a half later, even hallucinating, I couldn't come up with any more pain. So short term, and it was mild. And looking at these results, that green section of the bar represents mild. Most people had something similar to me. Far fewer people had redness or swelling. So those are the local reactions. If you look at the systemic reactions, the majority of people who had reactions had either fatigue or headache. And what you really want to look for is, okay, what about the severe ones? Well, that's what they call grade 4. And it is represented in this plot by the red line. And if you're looking at this, trying to look and see the red line and you can't find it, that's because it is really, really, really small. We're talking maybe 1 or 2 people. Okay, so what, in terms of this, what are the things that would be considered a severe reaction? The inability to go to work. That is one of those things. It is so bad that it inhibits your ability to work. We've now vaccinated about 90 of our field providers. We had 2 people who had to call off from work. One was because of a headache, and the other was because of a fever. The fever wasn't particularly high. He actually felt okay, but we don't want to put somebody with a fever on an ambulance. So we kept him out, got better in 2 days, and he went on his way. All right, so that is the Pfizer vaccine. Let's take a look at Moderna, and what you'll see is it looks very, very similar. Their efficacy was 94%, and you can also see that clear breakpoint with the Moderna. Their adverse events, they break them down. The paper is a little bit different. All of these images, by the way, come from the New England Journal of Medicine papers that were published. Those are open source right now, so you can go and freely download them. And they broke them down by the first 2 bars are placebo dose 1, then placebo dose 2, followed by the actual vaccine dose 1 and dose 2. And you'll notice that the majority of people had some adverse event, at least in terms of local. So about 80% of people had some localized adverse event. The majority of those were pain at the injection site, again, just like with the Pfizer. If you take a look at systemic effects, again, the vast majority were headache and fatigue. And they were higher with the second dose than with the first dose. You can see that a little bit with Pfizer, but it seems to be a little more pronounced with the Moderna. Again, very few of these were severe, but you can at least see the red numbers here. And again, in order to get to red, it has to be severe enough for you to not go to work for a day. So we're not talking about hospitalizations here. All right, so those are the big adverse events. With Moderna, I was actually able to dig a little bit more information out. The onset of these symptoms was day 1. So you really started to see it pretty early, and it didn't last very long. So for the first shot, the median duration was 2 days, lasted a little bit longer for the second shot. Those people under 65, ironically, seem to mount a more robust immune response and have more severe adverse events. So one of the ways that I like to think about it, I sort of felt cheated when I got my vaccine because I just got maybe a little soreness, and it made me question whether I had a wimpy immune system or not. Am I just not mounting a good enough response to protect me? There's no indication that that's the case. I'm just paranoid, and these are the things that go through my little Aggie brain. So I do like to think if you have a reaction, just the way I think about it is that is my body doing the work that it takes to protect me. Now, since we're going to be talking about hesitancy, I think it's probably important here to talk about why we're having these things. A lot of people will say they got the flu right after getting the flu vaccine. They did not get the flu. So what they got was their body's immune response to particles from a dead flu vaccine. You can't get the flu, the actual flu, from the flu vaccine, but you can get symptoms that are very similar. And the reason is it's your body making this immune response. So I think it's important that in order for us to help combat hesitancy, we be as open, honest, and transparent as possible. And a big part of that is educating people on what an expected immune response is. All right, so and this is just in numbers what we were seeing before. Again, same thing. All right. There have been a lot of concerns about Bell's palsy. This was primarily with the Moderna, and this is the data from the Moderna. If you go into some of the supplemental tables with the Pfizer, you'll see that the numbers were about the same. So what did we see? In the Moderna trial, there were roughly 14,000 people in each of the arms of the trial, the vaccine arm and the placebo arm. In the placebo arm, there was 1 case. In the vaccine arm, there were 3 cases. Now, this is one way to look at this is, oh my God, the vaccine caused 3 times more cases of Bell's palsy than did the placebo. Well, that would, if you're going on that logic, then you would also have to say, well, the placebo caused Bell's palsy in one case. And we know that's not really accurate. This leads us to something called a base rate fallacy. And a base rate fallacy also goes along with a coincidental fallacy. You're basically confusing correlation with causation. In order to identify this, one of the things you really need to look for is what is the base rate of Bell's palsy. So among people who didn't have a placebo and they didn't have vaccine, just going along their normal day, what is the incidence of Bell's palsy? Well, it's 3 cases per 14,000, even in people who didn't have the vaccine, who didn't have a placebo, who have never heard of COVID. And what you see is that the occurrence, you can take that and say, well, if I'm going to run a trial and I'm going to enroll 14,000 people, what is the expected rate of Bell's palsy? Well, it would be expected to be identical to what it is in the general population. And it turns out that's exactly what we see here. So this is the indication. This is the reason we're saying the vaccine is not causing Bell's palsy. We're seeing Bell's palsy at exactly the same rate we would expect to see it in the general population. All right. Now, the other thing that we're hearing is allergic reactions and anaphylaxis. So let's talk about where we're seeing this. We really didn't see much evidence of this in the clinical trials themselves. There were some allergic reactions, but they weren't particularly bad and they were rare. Well, with any trial, no matter how big the trial, and collectively we've now enrolled over 70,000 people in just these 2 trials, and there are, I want to say, about 150 different trials at various stages of various vaccines going on. There are a lot of people being enrolled, but with these 2, we had 70,000 people in them. That's a lot of people, but it pales in comparison to the 330 million people in the US alone. So even for something that's very, very rare, you may not see it in a trial. So that's the reason we do post distribution or post approval monitoring. So we have this system, the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, or VAERS, and that's where everybody puts in the adverse events that they think may have happened with the vaccine. So this paper came out on the 6th of January in MMWR, and it looks at all of the cases of allergic reaction and anaphylaxis that have been reported after the shot 1 of Pfizer. Why just shot 1 of Pfizer? Well, because that's all we've had time to really look at in this post-approval data set like this. All right, so what we know is that we have almost 1.9 million doses of Pfizer in people's arms as of the time they looked at this. They did see some anaphylaxis. They saw 21 cases of adjudicated anaphylaxis, which means independent reviewers looked at it and said, yeah, this is anaphylaxis. Or they went to a hospital and saw a physician who diagnosed them with anaphylaxis. There were, this is kind of covering my screen there. There we go. 83 cases of non-anaphylactic allergic reaction. And if you look at this table, you can get a little bit of information about what we saw. So median age, most of these, 71% of the anaphylaxis occurred within 15 minutes, 86% occurred within 30 minutes. And that's the reason you're seeing the CDC say, we want everybody to be watched for 15 minutes. If you've ever had an allergic reaction, hang out for 30 minutes. And then most of the people who had anaphylaxis or an allergic reaction had a prior episode or prior history of it. All right, what happened to these people? Well, one was lost to follow-up, so we can't really say what happened to him. But everybody we know about, which is 24 out of 25, went home and completely recovered. You can see that here, 90% of the folks with anaphylaxis got epi. I'm glad they got epi. That's kind of Anaphylaxis, as we know, is Latin for needs more epi. So they got it and they did well. So that's good. I felt like it was, since we're really focused on anaphylaxis, I wanted to put this in perspective. I like wrapping my brain around things by doing math. So if you look at the incidence of anaphylaxis reported through the VAERS system with the Pfizer vaccine, in other words, what we have data for, it's 11 per million doses. All right, well, what is it with, say, influenza? Let's compare it to that. Well, it's substantially higher. And you can even calculate an incidence risk ratio. It says you are 8.5 times more likely to have an anaphylactic reaction with the Pfizer vaccine than you are with the influenza vaccine. Okay, so anaphylaxis more likely with COVID. But I think we have to put that into perspective. We're not taking the COVID vaccine or the influenza vaccine because we just like getting vaccines. We're doing it to prevent the disease, and the disease can be lethal. So let's take a look. We now have had 349,000 deaths from COVID in 2020 in the US alone. Well, I went back and said, well, how does that compare to flu? And of the data that I had available, the last 5 years, 2015 was the worst influenza season in the last 5 years. That had a mortality of 51,000. The incident risk ratio there is 7-fold. So you're 7 times more likely to die from COVID than influenza. The bottom line is, yes, you're more likely to get anaphylaxis with the COVID vaccine and recover, by the way, but you're also way more likely to die. And kind of by definition, that means no recovery with COVID than you are with influenza. So for me, I decided that it was worth it to take it. But I think it's just useful if we actually give people the data. All right, so one question that pops up about this is, great, that data looks great. It clearly works. That means I can quit wearing my mask. Not quite so fast. Here is the reason that we need to continue wearing our masks until we get to herd immunity. And the reason is that we have to go back and remember that we're wearing masks both for ourselves and for other people to protect us and to prevent the spread of the disease. Well, what we know is that most people get infected from someone else who was asymptomatic at the time that the disease was spread. The more and more we learn about this, the more we see the importance of this asymptomatic spread. The trials, their outcomes were symptomatic COVID, not asymptomatic COVID. So what we know is that it decreases your risk of getting symptomatic COVID, of getting sick. We can't say, because that's not the point of the trials, we can't say whether it decreases asymptomatic positivity. Does it decrease your chances of getting the vaccine, of the virus? And we don't know whether it decreases asymptomatic spread. Now, there's certainly plenty of reason to think that it does, and certainly plenty of reason to hope that it does. But our job as leaders is not to make policy based on hope. It's to make policy based on science. And what the science says is we just can't answer that question. So until we hit herd immunity, keep wearing the masks. So hopefully that explains the reason we're saying keep wearing masks. It's not because we don't believe the vaccines work. It's because we believe the vaccines work to prevent you from getting sick. We just don't know about transmission yet. All right, let's talk quickly about vaccine hesitancy. What is it? Well, it's a refusal to accept it or delay your vaccines. And what we know is that vaccines are great, but they don't save lives. Vaccinations save lives. You got to get the needle in the arm to work, and you can have the best vaccine sitting on a shelf. If we don't get it into people's arms, it's not going to get us back to bars any quicker. Well, the literature says these are some of the causes of vaccine hesitancy. The biggest, I think, is that they work. I will tell you, I went to medical school. I graduated in 2005. I think I've seen one case of meningococcal meningitis. I don't think I have ever seen measles. If a kid walks into my ER with a rash from measles, I'm going to have a hard time diagnosing it because I've only seen it in textbooks. And the reason is because vaccines work. So when they work, people no longer have that fear of the virus, of the outcome. So I've never seen anybody with polio. My mom and my grandmother were deathly afraid of polio. I'm not, because vaccines have just knocked it out. I've never seen it. So we're a victim of our success. We mentioned the base rate fallacy, and this comes from post hoc ergo propter hop. And the main reason I put this on here is I like saying it. I'm a West Wing fan, and that was the title of one of the West Wing episodes, so I had to put it in there. Basically, that is confusing something. It is confusing correlation and causation, like we talked about. The other reason for vaccine hesitancy is we're Americans, and damn it, we don't like anybody telling us what to do. If you have mandatory vaccines, it's going to piss some people off, and they're not going to want to take it. I get it. I don't like doing things either when people tell me to do them. There is a fear because we can't control whether we get adverse events. And there's also this fear because who gets adverse events and which adverse events you get are completely unpredictable. It feels like you're playing Russian roulette. We just don't know. We're very familiar with the adverse events, the flu-like symptoms, emphasize flu-like symptoms, but we're not very familiar with the actual disease, again, because of our success. People hear big, long chemical names of ingredients, and that freaks us out. We have a huge section of the population that is very concerned about GMOs, genetically modified organisms. I have a golden doodle, so I'm clearly okay with GMOs. My golden doodle is a GMO, but some people are very concerned about that. We clearly have a very low trust in institutions right now, probably at the lowest point it's been. So we just don't trust people. We don't trust the pharmaceutical industry. We don't trust government. We don't trust public health. We just don't trust anybody. And when those are the people trying to tell us that vaccines work, it's harder for a lot of us to believe that. And then I think we have all probably noticed that the rise of the internet and social media has been wonderful for getting good scientific information out, but it's been just as good for transmitting misinformation and outright disinformation. So it's a real challenge. Those are the causes. There is some good news, bad news about this. In all of the polls on this, still the overwhelming majority of people think getting immunized is important, and they're doing it, but we are seeing a rise in hesitancy. And in order for these vaccines to work, we really need herd immunity. And I'll just skip over the science behind it, but the bottom line is R0, which is the ability to transmit the disease, is also related to herd immunity and how much you have to have. So we're estimating we need about 80% of the population to be immune from COVID. So what can we do? There are all sorts of things. As a scientist and as a nerd, I want better measurement. We think that's important. We need more funding for vaccine counseling. Our poor pediatricians and family physicians who are trying to give people advice on vaccines on a day in, day in basis, they don't get paid for that. They get paid much like we do to move the meat through their clinic. And that's a real challenge because counseling and overcoming hesitancy takes time. And we really need to structure this so that they can get paid to sit down and do this counseling. We really need lots and lots of transparency. And the bottom line on transparency is we need to make all of the data publicly available. The worst thing we could possibly do is say this is proprietary data and not share it. We need lots of information on public education. I've been incredibly impressed with the amount of information from EMS physicians on what these viruses are, what the vaccines are, and how they work. And then I think it's important then we lead by example. And I just want to end with this picture. Hillary Gates with EMS World got this hashtag going, EMS Vax. And she wanted people who got the vaccine to show that they got it. So medical directors responded, and you can see this is a very, very small subset of the pictures we had available. These are all, with the exception of the blonde woman with the blue mask right between Mark Escott and Ben Abo. All of these are EMS medical directors. The reason we do this is people want to know, what would you do, doctor? Well, these doctors, including myself, we rolled our sleeves up. We wanted that vaccine as soon as we can get it. Now, why do I include the blonde woman there? Because right after, the number one question people want to know is, what would you do? The number two question they want to know is, what would you tell your family? Well, that's my sister. She's an occupational therapist in New Orleans. She called me and said, what do you think I should do? And I said, roll your sleeve up. So she did. So I think it's really important that we get that information out. And with that, we'll go back to you, John.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Really appreciate the information and the perspective. As you're taking your slides down, I want to reinforce to folks, there have been a phenomenal number of questions and comments in the chat. So everybody, please take advantage of looking through the chat. Dr. Miramonte has provided a little bit of perspective on what they have experienced in San Antonio. We'll go to the panel here for just a second, and I'll ask the panel to introduce themselves as they provide questions or comments. I want to open up, though, with one of the questions that came up in the chat, which is a really important question that is worth addressing. And it has to do with the fact that the mRNA vaccines are relatively new technology-based vaccines. But with such a new vaccine, isn't it true that we won't know the long-term effects or toxicity? And I'm assuming that that is in relationship to the vaccine for approximately 4 to 5 years. So Jeff, any thoughts or comments on that? And then we'll go to the panel.
Sure. So one, I think I won't get into the mechanism for the vaccines, but I think it's worth learning about. If for no other reason, that I think biochemistry is phenomenally cool. And I think this mechanism is just wicked cool the way it works. But it's not plausible that these things would lead to a lot of the things we worry about. But the bottom line is you're right. We have limited amount of evidence. And sure, it is possible that you'll grow an arm out of your forehead 10 years down the road. Now, we have no mechanism for how that could happen, but we can't prove it doesn't. And that's just the way science works. Again, to decrease hesitancy, the best thing we can do is be honest. And the honest answer is we don't know. Now, what we do know, however, is what the consequence of COVID is now. 350,000 people in the US alone have died. It's not just like the flu. We saw the worst flu of the past 5 years killed 50,000. We know that this vaccine, at least in the short term, provides good immunity, and we can save lives with it. And there is no apparent danger from it other than the things we discussed. So everything in life is a trade-off. It's a risk-benefit ratio. So I think we have to be aware of that and realize that there is no such thing as a safe vaccine if your definition of safety means absolutely zero adverse events. Life is risk. I think the risk-benefit ratio promotes vaccination, but I also think we have to be honest and say, you're right. We don't have 5 years worth of monitoring of this vaccine.
Thank you, Jeff. I will add on to that one of the advantages that I think we have with the vaccine, and I agree, we won't know until we follow this over time, but the messenger RNA is broken down relatively quickly after it starts to elicit the immune response. The nanoparticles that help with the transfer into cells also are broken down relatively quickly. So part of the optimism I think that folks have is that the components of the vaccine itself break down in the body very, very quickly as the immune response is being kicked up. So yeah, the extra arm, may come about as a result of changes in the immune response. We don't know that yet, but concern from the direct components of the vaccine, we think will be relatively limited.
So, John, I'm sorry, just to
Please.
one additional thing about that, because I do think when we talk about things like shooting webs out of your wrist, and I'm very disappointed I still can't do that, and glowing in the dark, what we're worried about here is maybe the vaccine is going in and changing my DNA. Mechanistically, it can't do that. That's just not how this works. And that's just with my DNA. Now, then the question is, well, will my kid have a third arm? And that's a whole different cell line. So the germ line is different than our normal cell lines. And it can't do that either. So there's just no mechanism for the third arm. And I think I have to get the chemical reaction and nuclear exposure for the spider webs, but it's just, I think I'm going to have to be disappointed about that.
Thanks, Jeff. All right, turning to the panel. Let's just start, if we can, by location on the Hollywood Squares grid. Carol.
Oh, great presentation, Jeff. I think one of the things I'm actually excited about the messenger RNA because it doesn't have the virus in it. And we've been telling our providers that your body actually produces messenger RNA. I think the other thing that I brought up at one of our statewide webinars to EMS that will encourage people to take the vaccine is, everybody's worried about that it prevents the disease, but for those of you who have been on the call, COVID is having some long-term effects that people aren't talking about. And those side effects, we don't know. We know headache, chronic fatigue, shortness of breath, certainly things that can impact your ability to work, the quality of your life in the future. So I think that needs to be highlighted. And then lastly, one of the things I mentioned on one of our webinars is look at the history of other illnesses that we've had. And the three I focused on were HIV, herpes, and the post 9/11 illnesses that people have. When HIV was out, everybody was dying, but now we have antivirals and people are living with the disease. But certainly if there was a vaccine, wouldn't you rather take the vaccine and not get the disease than to be treating it for the rest of your life and living with some of the side effects? So I think providers need to take that into consideration too when they are deciding whether or not to get it. Again, looking at that long-term impact. 9/11 happened in 2001 and people are still having side effects, but it's not headline news anymore. And our medical community is dealing with it, but society doesn't have that on their radar. Like COVID, hopefully 10 years from now will also not be on our radar. But thank you, this has been very helpful.
Thanks, Carol, appreciate it. Dan.
Jeff, great presentation. I got the impression that you have some connection to the state of Texas. With that, one of the things that with vaccine hesitancy kind of gives me pause is the fact that, we've seen within our own ranks within healthcare people that wanted to eschew masks. They didn't want to adopt masks. They didn't believe the seriousness of COVID, even while there was tremendous outbreaks in their community. And with vaccine hesitancy, I'm just concerned. As a medical director, do you see this as a sea change within EMS organizations? And if you do, how do we work to overcome that, to restore credibility within our own organizations? And again, great presentation. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, man. So I think I would love to say, so Carol mentioned HIV. I was a a paramedic and a EMT and a paramedic student when we first really started worrying about that in the mid to late 80s, at least by the time it trickled down to me. When I started in the field, I never wore gloves. Gloves were a sign of weakness, much like air packs were for firefighters. That was a sign of weakness. You don't see people going in. I mean, we just have it imprinted in our brains now to put gloves on before you walk in. I would love to say that this has absolutely been a sea change, and now just baseline PPE on all respiratory issues is going to be a mask going forward. I
Thanks,
wish
Steve.
I could say that. I don't know that I can. Maybe I'll be wrong. Maybe I'm just being a half empty sort of guy here. I can tell you that there is resistance within my EMS agency. And I don't believe it is because they don't believe they work. I think it's because they're a pain in the butt. I mean, I'm in the ER. Y'all wear these damn things too. They are a pain in the butt. I don't like them. So we all have a tendency to not do something we don't want to do. But I think it is very important for us to lead by example. So wear the things. I would hate to, I can tell you when I see one of my ambulances driving down the road, I'm looking to see if they have masks on. And so is the general population. So it's really important that we model good behavior.
Thanks, Dan. David.
Sorry, couldn't get it off mute fast enough. Jeff, that was truly amazing. And Rick and John, the bar gets set higher and higher for your upcoming speakers. I do think you'll have to require that all future speakers use either a West Wing or a Spider-Man reference, or they just can't present. So great presentation. I really enjoyed it. We have had a lot of vaccine hesitancy in the West Central Ohio region, and it varies. Unfortunately, we had an EMS provider fatality, and the agencies that are close to that, we're 80% are getting the vaccination. The agencies that are further away, we have some that are less than 10%. So we keep plugging away at this, and I will be posting as a link to this presentation as soon as Bruce has it up, because I think he did a spectacular job. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. We'll go to the polling questions in just a second, but Dr. Hunt.
Yeah, I want to, excuse me, I want to let you get to the polling, but I a couple of comments. John and I go back and forth seemingly daily trying to figure out what's the best use of time for the rounds. And based on what our observations have been on the recent rounds, the vaccination hesitancy, double down on it. And Jeff, thank you for helping double down on it. Because what has been clear watching the chat and so forth over the past few weeks or so, the quest for information by EMS clinicians it's huge. What I struggle with this is there's vaccine hesitancy, but I also think within EMS, just like the rest of our country, the public, is there people that have just drawn lines in the sand, and it's not hesitancy. We're not going to do it. We're just not going to do this. And so, Jeff, I'm curious, what do you do? Do you just spend energy on the hesitancy and basically, okay, the line in the sand, greatest good for the greatest number, not so much energy on that? Or do we really try to keep doing that breakthrough? Because this is not like the measles where we're trying to turn things around. I mean, how many, September 11th a day are we having? This is greatest catastrophe in a year. I've said it 5,000 times. I don't think people's minds and hearts are around that concept. And I'm not sure what to do with that. Jeff, thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. So one, I just want to go for a trifecta and get a Star Trek reference in and say, I agree with you completely. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. So there is an interesting thing. I listen to podcasts a lot when I'm out running, and I've been listening to a psychology podcast about something called the backfire effect. And what happens, it's basically where you have someone who has a little bit of an idea about something. So in this case, it is they have a little seed planted in their brain that vaccines don't work, or vaccines are bad, or Bill Gates's 5G, whatever the issue is. They're not really committed to that, but there's just a little seed. And then somebody who means well, like all of us, come in and try to convince them that they're wrong. And what the psychology on this says is that all of that information, the corrections, the trying to give additional information, actually just reinforces I'd say the wrong, but that incorrect notion to begin with. It's incredibly frustrating, and it means it's really, really hard to approach. So basically, someone who thinks vaccines cause autism, the more we try to prove it doesn't, the more they believe it does. Nobody said psychology was straightforward, but that's what we see. So my approach is I absolutely don't invest myself in convincing people. I don't try. What I try to do is put the information out there. If people have questions, I try to honestly answer them as best I can, but I don't try to tell them what to do. And I don't know what the right answer to this is. By the way, if you look at all the literature that says how to overcome vaccine hesitancy, all of them, the systemic reviews say, we don't know, nothing works. So this is a real conundrum, and it's a real challenge. And somebody just saw, what is the podcast? I'm going to have to look because I can't remember. Oh, it's You're Not So Smart. Sorry.
Hey, thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you. Bruce, can we quickly go to the polling questions? Again, folks, some of these you have seen in the past. As of today, EMS agency is experiencing prolonged off times at local emergency departments. Oh, and folks are jumping on this one. Thank you. Yep, we'll keep going for a couple seconds here. All right, 10 more people answer and we'll have hit 60%. Oh, you're gonna do it, come on. 2 more. 60%, thank you. Bruce, can you show us the results? 41% yes. A quarter of the folks, no, non-applicable. You're not currently transporting patients to emergency departments. Got it, thank you. Question number 2. When the local EDs, the longest time we're experiencing has been a couple more seconds here. You guys are really hammering on these quickly. Thank you. All right. Oh, one more just kicked in. Good. Bruce, let's see what we've got. Non-applicable, but most of them are less than an hour. Certainly not seeing many that are over 3 to 5 hours. Great, thank you. Next question. As of today, vaccine and vaccination plan information sharing with EMS is more than adequate, adequate, less than adequate. Oh, you guys are chiming in very nicely today. Thank you. And the verdict is, Rick, I think we're making some progress because we didn't have over half indicating adequate in the past. So very nice. Next question, please. I'm confident in receiving the COVID vaccine, which will be available to my agency.
Hey, John, you know, on that,
Please.
yeah, on the last question, when I say, I think we made some progress on the rounds with this topic. I mean, you participants, you got to be ambassadors. You know, not everybody is showing up in EMS for the rounds, and that's not an ask for you to like send links and so forth, but you're listening to this and a lot of your colleagues aren't, and that's not a negative. It's just like people busy get it, but you got to be ambassadors for this stuff, because otherwise, I mean, you got to be the force multipliers for greatest good, greatest number. You just have to be.
Great point, Rick. Thank you. All right, we've got over 65, almost 70% responding. Bruce? Yes. Thank you. At least among you all, this is wonderful to hear. And we'll reinforce Rick's comment about getting the message out there. Thanks. Next question, please. And again, you all are chiming in very, very quickly. Thank you. We're over 65%. Over 70%. Great. Bruce, can you show us the responses, please? Still got a couple of folks, but that's fine. We're getting there. We'll continue to address the questions as best we can. And I think this is the last question. Oh, no, we've got two more. Yes, this is the last question. Will your agency be involved in COVID vaccination administration in your community? And this is something that we need to continue working with the health departments and the healthcare systems. And again, another opportunity to be a force multiplier. Great responses. Thank you. Bruce, can you show us the breakdown? A little over half will be, about a third don't know yet. All right, fabulous. Thank you. Jeff, based on those questions, any final thoughts from your perspective?
I don't think so. I'm glad to see. I'm hopeful. I'm going to be an optimist. I'm hopeful that most of our providers are going to decide they want to. I've been one of the things that's interesting on social media, as all of us were posting our pictures, there was a palpable excitement in my hospital when I went to get it. We are so tired of this, and we were so excited when we were able to get it, and we are just bursting out and wanting to share that excitement on social media and with our friends. And I think there is now, I think that's a little infectious, the enthusiasm is. And my hope is, maybe it's just wishful thinking, but I think that some perhaps people who might have been a little hesitant are maybe seeing our excitement, and it might be bleeding off on them a little bit. So I'm going to be optimistic. Despite the way the start we've had, I think this year is going to be better than last year. That's my prediction.
Thank you for the prediction. Thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts and perspectives with us, as has been reflected in the chat. Great presentation, great information. Jeff, thank you. Panelists, thank you. Audience, thank you. Echo staff, thank you. Again, we're off to a great start in 2021. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We will see you next week for EMS rounds. If you have the time, emergency department rounds tomorrow. I'm sorry, critical care rounds tomorrow, therapeutics mini-series on Wednesday, and ED rounds on Thursday. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next week.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jeff.